Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining this session on the impact of open science or open research practices on research integrity. So the session will last for about an hour and 15 minutes, including 10 minutes presentations from our panelists, and then a Q&A session. You should be able to see my slide at this point with pictures of our panelists. So my name is Andrea. I work as a principal consultant at Research Consulting. We are a consultancy company based in the UK, and we work to improve the effectiveness and impact of research and scholarly communication. Get us started. I'll give you a quick summary of what this session is about, and then I'll hand over to our first speaker. And just so you know, I'll do all the introductions at the beginning so we can then focus on the presentation. So the session looks at how practices such as open access publishing, open data and code sharing, or preprinting promise to foster a more transparent, a more collaborative, and a more efficient research ecosystem. But what we don't really understand today is what is the impact of these practices on research integrity. And this is what we'd like to explore today. So we have 4 experts joining us. We will start from Clarissa, who is a pharmacist by training, who has turned meta researcher. Apologies, my screen is misbehaving. Well, I'll just continue without screen sharing because something odd. Anyway, I was saying, Clarissa is a pharmacist by training. She turned meta researcher over the course of her career. She has been working as a research fellow at the Quest Center since 2022, with projects focused on the experimental design of preclinical experiments. She is interested in how open scholarship practices can improve the rate of successful translation of research from preclinical to clinical settings. Then we have Roohi, who is the ambassador for researcher success at CACTUS. She's passionate about advocating for researchers and amplifying the voices on a global stage. She is the co-chair of Peer Review Week 2023 and the co-chair of the India chapter of the European Association of Science Editors. Then we have Matt, who is a research integrity manager at the UK Research Integrity Office. He supports the work of the charity, including the advisory service, the development of policies and publications, as well as social media. He worked in open access science journal publishing for 18 years, and he is an elected council member of the Committee on Publication Ethics, and he is also treasurer of the European Association of Science Editors. And last but not least, we have Catriona, who is Director of Open Science at Hindawi. She has 24 years experience in scholarly publishing, including 20 years in open access publishing. She is a founding individual in the Initiative for Open Citations and the Initiative for Open Abstracts, and a past member of OASPA, the DORA Steering Committee, the Dryad Board, and the Advisory Board for the Royal Society on Publishing. Now, all I want to add before we begin is that you can add your questions as through all other presentations using the Q&A box in Zoom. Please state who the question is for so we can start a discussion from the right person, and then we'll open it up to all other speakers. So I'll stop here and hand over to Clarissa for the first presentation. So over to you, Clarissa.
Thank you. I will share my screen. If you could just give me a thumbs up that everything's working. Or I will just start now. Okay. Thank you for the introduction and for the invitation to join this panel and to open this discussion. My research background, as Andrea said, is mostly in biomedical sciences, and I'm an early career researcher. So most of my presentation will come from this perspective. So just have this in mind. During my PhD, I studied the issues of reproducibility in biomedical sciences, and this idea or this concept of that solid scientific findings should be reproducible is not necessarily new. This has been present in science from the beginning and has been summarized by Karl Popper as the effect that the non-reproducible single occurrences are of no significance to science. But recently, it has been pointed out that we might have been taking reproducibility for granted, especially in biomedical science. It was sparked by some numbers from pharmaceutical industries that pointed that up to 21%, or in some cases 11%, of academic findings could be replicated in an industrial setting with the goal of translating this biological findings and treatments to humans. When I'm talking about reproducibility, I am talking about very broadly this different definitions of reproducibility. Both, I'll be talking about all of them at once in a way. That reproducibility could mean multiple analysis of the same data set, or repeating the same experimental protocol, or making some changes to the experimental protocol and still finding the same results, or even just changing the research plan completely but still obtaining qualitatively similar conclusions. And this is important because all of these different types of reproducibility will have different reasons for why it fails, but the top ones that I've been finding that have been mentioned for reproducibility more general are named in this slide. That includes poor experimental design, selective reporting, incomplete reporting, suboptimal quality assurance or quality control practices in the laboratories, and that there are limitations with statistical analysis that are not so informative as we expect in the lab. I left it very tiny here, fraud and fabrication as possible causes for research reproducibility failures, because we like to believe that this is not the case for the majority. This is very much more difficult to prove and to test to see if there was the case, while other reasons for failure can be more easily manageable with open research practices. So the general solution for reproducibility in biomedical research, but I believe this is also applicable to other fields, is just open everything, open the analysis, the data, the results, the material, the methods, the hypothesis, open everything that's possible to open. To make this possible, I like this paradigm, this framework that's used by the Center for Open Science to how this culture can be changed. And when I'm thinking about the publishing scenario, I like to think that the biggest role could be in making it easier for the researchers to engage in open science practices. And I have here just some examples, if I have the time to share them. I've seen really nice examples of publishers making it easy to use preprints by providing some direct connections to preprint servers so that you can submit your preprint directly to the journal. But I've also seen cases where it didn't work, and my personal experience with one publisher was that we had to make big changes to the manuscript formatting that was then very quickly assessed by the editor that the manuscript was out of scope for the journal. So this could have been saved a lot of time for us if this editorial assessment came before the journal requirements, and if this link to the preprint is already there. I can probably elaborate more on that later if anyone has questions. But yeah, and also to share data in code, I've also had some experiences where submission platforms are not accepting data in other formats that's not text, like Word text files or Excel files, because they do not convert. So to share a code that replicates a figure in my manuscript, I had to convert it to a Word text file, and it doesn't really work like that. Like the code cannot be reproducible in a text format. It needs to be in the original file format. And also, I would like to highlight this issue of redundant administrative burdens. And for example, some data sharing statements, depending on the journal workflow, it has many different steps to agree to data sharing. So when clicking checkboxes or writing a compliance statement, or even just providing the actual DOI of the data from a repository. So this, as has been named by one researcher before, this might lead to the death of by 1,000 10-minute tasks. And also in terms of funder compliance, and this links to also geographic diversity of authors in comparison to the journals. In that case, some journals that are based, for example, in the US, they take a lot of time during the submission process to ask about NIH funding and US government responsibilities and requirements that are not applicable to the rest of the world. And we just have to keep on clicking through multiple pages of funder compliance that are not really directly applicable. Again, these are very small tasks, but they build up to a very lengthy submission process that doesn't necessarily add a lot to the research itself, to the quality of the manuscripts and of the publications. There are some caveats to how journals could act, in my opinion, is that not all open science practices, are applicable to all research outputs and all research fields equally. So there will be different requirements and some specificities that could be applicable to different fields. Whatever policies are chosen by the journal or the publisher, this is not always clear, in my opinion, to me as an author or as a reviewer, and especially not as a reader, being unaware of how does the acceptance process to a journal works, helped me select what kind of journals I want to read and what kind of papers I want to cite and base my research on. Making sure that any checklists are useful for someone, meaning that these reporting checklists that might sometimes be required by authors to submit together with the paper are not always used or not always published together with the manuscript. So this creates this redundant burdens that are not really helping anyone. So just, yeah, having this being useful would be great. And yeah, I think we are seeing a change now for the big team science, and this has also been a struggle for me. My largest author list for me has been like about 30 authors, and this has been a pain to include each and every one of them as authors list in the submission systems, but other journals have made it so much easier by having the authors themselves include their contributorship declarations and their conflict of interest statements individually. This was really a great experience for me. Yeah, I think this is a summary of what I had to say about reproducibility and how it can open science practice can contribute to reproducibility in the context of research integrity. And I'm happy to take questions later.
Thanks, Clarissa. Great presentation. And now we're ready to move on to Roohi.
Andrea, thank you very much for the opportunity and for inviting me here. And Clarissa, thank you. That was very insightful. Just give me a second and okay. I hope everyone can see the screen now. I'm going to, I think, focus, I'll just briefly talk about what the focus of my session is going to be. It's going to be about the long-standing threats to research integrity and how these issues have probably been compounded or multiplied because of the changes that are happening, whether it is the introduction of AI or open science or everything else, and how open science can actually play a role to address some of these research integrity issues. So in a gist, that's what I'm going to speak about. Now, if you recall the last year as part of Peer Review Week 2022, the theme was research integrity, creating trust, creating and supporting trust in research. And as part of CACTUS's Peer Review Week 2022 celebrations, we had conducted a global survey to find out what researchers think about the role of peer review in maintaining research integrity. We had about 825 people across the world participating in the survey, and we had about close to 700 people who gave us their consent to use survey findings and to use that data. So what you see, the results that I will share with you today are going to be based on that survey. The audience group was very mixed. We had people across different levels, from different geographies, different subject areas, and different levels of experience. So there were about over 60% of survey takers who had published more than one paper, and there were about 35% who had published more than 5 papers. Even in terms of gender diversity, there were about 44% of female researchers, and the rest were male. So I think in terms of being able to get diverse perspectives, I feel happy that we were able to do that through this survey. If you look at the data that is up on the slide right now, you will see that about 43.39% said that they did encounter manuscripts. So these were people with peer reviewing experience, and they said that they did encounter manuscripts where they suspected a breach of research integrity. And 24.9%, 94% were not very sure, whereas 31% were did not suspect any breach of integrity in the research that they were reviewing. Even in terms of the issues that they encountered. So I think there were some questions in the survey that were around the issues that peer reviewers probably faced, and plagiarism was at about 65.33%, where peer reviewers suspected issues of plagiarism. Then the next one was questionable or unethical research practices at 44.53%. And then there was fabricated or falsified data, including image manipulation at 36.86%. So I think these were interesting findings for what peer reviewers felt as they were reviewing research manuscripts, and the kind of issues that they encountered. Even in terms of threats to research integrity, plagiarism was considered to rank the first in terms of severity when it came to research integrity, again followed by fabricated or falsified data or image manipulation, and then fake papers produced by paper mills, and salami slicing and potential conflicts of interest. Now, even in response to the issues that peer reviewers did find as they were reviewing their manuscripts, there were some who approached the journal editor. There were some who maybe just consulted a friend to figure out what they should do in this case. So I think the way that the peer reviewers even dealt with the situation was different in each case. And I think that these issues, right, have probably just compounded or have multiplied with with paper mills or with tools like ChatGPT, where paper mills are producing so much, like there's an increasing number of manuscripts, and these they're basically learning how to escape AI checks. And then of course you have tools like ChatGPT, which completely introduce a new dimension of plagiarism. So even in over the last year, right, from 2022 to 23, these issues have probably been further compounded. And I feel like, if you look at the different stakeholders in academia, whether it is publishers, reviewers, and researchers, the goal at the end of the day for the publishers to publish sound research, for the reviewer, it is to contribute to the dissemination of quality science. For researchers, it is to publish research in, like, say, a high impact factor journal, or to advance science, advance their research career. But at every stage, for every stakeholder, right, there are challenges, of course, and we're all aware of that, right? For publishers, it would probably be the high number of papers submitted, and the increase in the number of retractions, issues not getting picked up during the peer review stage. For reviewers, it is the pressure to publish. Like, if you look at just number data, you will see that a typical academic would probably do 4.73 reviews per year, and they would spend maybe about 4 to 5 hours to complete each review. That amounts to a considerable amount of time. And they're expected to do this without, like, say, any monetary rewards or any benefit or reward, so to say. And for researchers, of course, it is the high pressure to publish, the time taken to acceptance, where they risk their research actually losing significance if it is time sensitive. So I feel these are the challenges that they are facing, which also in a way can contribute to integrity issues. And as we look at open science, how do we help address how can open science help address research integrity issues? And I think one is that it basically provides like crowdsourced engagement, because you have it encourages a broader community of researchers to engage with the research process. It can lead to better detection of potential research integrity issues that may otherwise go unnoticed. You have more researchers who are aware of who have access to a lot more resources, to case studies, and because of that the awareness automatically becomes higher, and we can avoid these integrity issues. Of course, there's peer monitoring, because if everything's open, the data is out there, it can encourage more robust peer monitoring, where researchers are more likely to detect, to identify, to report questionable practices. And of course, it is, if there is a group of researchers or there's collaboration, then there's a higher chance of best practices being followed and the group collectively addressing these integrity challenges. There is enhanced transparency, there's accountability, because data is openly available. It allows for better scrutiny, it allows for verification of research, it makes it and all of this makes it more difficult for unethical practices like fabricating or falsifying data to go unnoticed. Data sharing, of course, sharing complete data sets can discourage maybe the practice of salami slicing. Collaborative peer reviews can ensure that issues of plagiarism or identifying data manipulation are caught early on. And of course, there's early sharing through preprints as well, which can contribute to more comprehensive, more honest research reporting. So I feel like open science does have the power to basically address some of these research integrity issues. And in my opinion, right, we talk about it many a times as the outlier, but it should be like the norm, where what researchers and research institutions can do, similar to what Clarissa spoke about, is make it possible, make it, institutions should have the right infrastructure to store data. They should make it easy to provide the support for researchers, make it normative, like should encourage model good research practices, make it rewarding for those who are conducting research responsibly, conducting research with complete integrity. So I think it is like a collaborative or a collective effort that each stakeholder needs to probably take steps towards research integrity. And there are, of course, manual integrity checks or technical reviews that can be done to detect these compromised manuscripts. So say, for instance, when we talk about manual integrity checks, you would probably have checks for identifying paper mill submissions, or fabricated content checks, or scope match check, funding information, data availability statements. When it comes to the technical review, you would probably check for article types and methods, or results discrepancy, image manipulation. Peer review checks can be done to identify a compromised peer review process, review affiliations, time taken for review. So I think these are the different manual as well as technical checks that can be run to detect compromised manuscripts, and they can be done at every stage. So you would probably have one round of review, probably one check before the formal peer review, where after the first level of an editorial check, we may want to do like a second level of check to identify, to flag high-risk manuscripts that are compromised due to any of the following, like say author integrity issues or fabricated content or image manipulation or issues with research novelty. Then there's another round of check, that is the third level, that could take place post acceptance or pre-publication, again to check for author integrity, fabricated content, issues with research novelty, or a compromised peer review process. And again, after publication, that the check needs to continue. We need to constantly keep looking for maybe like flag manuscripts that are of poor quality, reduce the number of manuscripts going for formal peer review, improve the quality of manuscripts that are being peer reviewed to reduce the risk of retractions, and of course, to improve the reputation of the publisher. So I feel like and of course, there are services also being developed that do these manual and technical checks. But even in an independent capacity, if these checks are done at a more formalized or organized level, I think it can go a long way in improving the trust, or in building the trust that that is there in research itself. So I think, yeah, that brings me to the end of my my session, but happy to take any questions at the end.
Thanks, Roohi, and thanks for our audience as well for using the Q&A box. Please do continue to submit your questions for our panelists. And we are now ready to move on to Matt's presentation. So over to you, Matt.
Great. Hopefully you can hear me. I'm on headphones sitting in the lobby of a Holiday Inn in Manchester. So apologies if there's any background noise or you have any difficulty hearing me. Let me just see how I... it's the big green button. There we go. Okay, so hopefully that's come up. Yeah, so I'm going to keep my video off because of bandwidth. Yep, okay, I've got the thumbs up from Andrea, so I'm going to go ahead. Right, so so my talk is obviously on that interaction between research integrity and open science, and I'll be posing the question, without transparency, do we have any integrity? My laptop doesn't want to work. Okay, so I'm sure you're all familiar with this Latin phrase from the Roman poet Horace, and what it means for those of you who are not schooled in classic Latin is that because I'm not tied to or vowed to any master, I can go where the winds take me and make that my home. And by that, Horace was saying that he wasn't tied to any particular philosophical school. And so wherever the reasoning took him, that is where he was happy to be. So it's a lovely idea of academic freedom. And from that, the Royal Society took those words that I've highlighted in blue there, nullius in verba, and that means by nobody's word alone, which essentially means don't take anybody's word for it, or in the X-Files speak, trust no one. And so that's essentially the position that we may have reached now in research is that because of challenges to research integrity, we've had to shift from that old paradigm where we had trust, and there was sort of an old boys network where everybody knew each other. Wasn't necessarily that good, but we've moved towards a system where we've realized that we can't any longer trust each other, that we've got to actually show things rather than just assert them. And in the UK, there's the Concordat to support research integrity. Concordat is a fancy word for agreement. And this is a graphic we created at UKRIO, which has the different aspects of research integrity that are from that Concordat. So there's honesty and rigor and respect and accountability. And last but not least, there's transparency. And so all of those come together to create research integrity. It's clear that transparency is an important thing. It independently came up in the definition of predatory journals that I was involved in the summit of helping define. So they're entities that prioritize self-interest, and they're characterized by being false or misleading, deviating from best practice, lacking transparency, and using aggressive practices. And so that lack of transparency is something that's key about poor publishing practice and about poor research practice. And so I think this is this graph is one of my favorite graphs about the power of transparency and essentially holding researchers to what they say they will do. So this is publication year across the bottom, and then you've got the relative risk of the primary outcome along the y-axis. And so before 2000, you can see that there's this scatter results, and all those pluses are what you would call positive results, where the outcome was statistically significant, showing that the primary outcome there was a relative risk towards that. And so there's lots and lots of pluses, and then suddenly you hit 2000, and then after that, there's all these blue circles, and that shows that there was the null hypothesis couldn't be rejected. And the important thing that happened was that there was a requirement for pre-registration of the primary outcomes for clinical trials. So before that, and this was NIH cardiovascular section, I think that's Heart, Lung and Blood Institute. So what they found was that even though these were researchers getting funding from a very well-respected funding agency, probably from well-respected institutions, before 2000, essentially, they'd been fiddling the books. So they'd been reporting things in a way that would give positive results. And then when they were forced to be registering their primary outcomes, make other changes, then they would actually report much more null outcomes. So there were almost no positive results at all. And so it's a complete sea change. So this shows the power of this transparency of reporting, is that if you have to follow what you agreed to beforehand, suddenly it changes the way that science is reported. Now that's happened in clinical trials, and it's happened subsequently in other areas of science, such as the ones that Clarissa was saying in pharmaceutical sciences, and kind of things that are leading on to the pharma industry, but it's also things that have happened a lot in psychology as well. There was a big replication crisis around about 2010, 2011, where lots of very celebrated results in behavioral priming were shown to essentially be the emperor's new clothes. And so there's the idea here that essentially we've got to be showing everything. So, and I think in storytelling, there's this idea that you should show and not tell. You should show your reader what's happening rather than just telling them what's happening. And I think that equally applies in research. You shouldn't just tell people what the results are. You have to show them what the results are. And that includes, for example, here from the PLOS-1 guidelines. I used to work for PLOS-1, but this was brought in after I was at PLOS, that all of the original uncropped and unadjusted images for all blots and gels need to be provided to the journal, and so that they can scrutinize what the originals were. And this is because of the rampant duplication and manipulation of images that's been happening, as much reported on PubPeer. So we're getting to the point at which we actually need researchers to show all of the original files, maybe the documentation of the research, the ethics approval, the consent forms, all of the data points. Maybe information even, who did it. So maybe electronic lab records. All of this is part of open science. So there's the idea of open notebook science, where all of the results are immediately available in public as soon as they're recorded. So for many people, this is a very exciting future. It means that everything is going to be very transparent, and immediately it's going to be loggable and trackable. However, not everybody is so excited by this. So particularly from the humanities, there's a backlash where people feel that this is surveillance. So there's this phrase, the panopticon of science. So this was, I think it was Jeremy Bentham, was a philosopher in the 19th century. And he had this idea that for a perfect prison, you needed people to be constantly surveyed. So they were prison. And essentially people feel that this openness that we're getting with open platforms is essentially creating near real-time surveillance, so that people feel that rather than being in this welcoming open science community, they're actually essentially being spied on and restricted. So I don't necessarily know how far I agree with this criticism, but it's one that's out there, and it's one that's definitely limiting the reach of open science. So it's something that we have to be aware of as we're trying to persuade people of this new paradigm, where we've moved from these ideas of quality, in inverted commas, to transparency of the new paradigm that's coming in. There's also pushback on preprints. So there's a very provocative tweet by Emily Bender, who's become quite well known as a critic of AI in research. And this was the context that it was in, is that there's lots of what she feels is junk being produced in computer science at the moment. And a lot of it's going on to arXiv. So arXiv came out in the early 90s as to publish high energy physics, but it's got much broader than that. And so she literally said arXiv is a cancer that promotes the dissemination of junk science. And so she feels that it's essentially promoting this idea of a rush, that anything old is irrelevant. And there's this culture where she wants things to be slow scholarship. So there's the idea of slow food, slow cinema, these kind of things where you need to actually relax and take things in. And she feels that actually that's a benefit, and it's something that open science is contributing to degrading. So there's this kind of hype cycle, and everything has to be new and wonderful, and maybe is shoddy and maybe isn't going to get reproduced, which would actually counter one of the actual aims of open science. We've also got criticism about the culture of open science. So Olivia Guest, one of the authors of this piece in Psychologist, Kirsty Whitaker's the other one, coined this term for open science in about 2017 on Twitter. And so it's this idea of like bro programmers. So it's a similar, by analogy to that, it's people who are being quite hostile and pushy. And instead of trying to bring people into open science, they're really kind of bullying people and belittling people who are not doing their brand of open science. So we have to make sure that instead of being kind of hostile, that we should bring people with us and encourage people, instead of kind of penalizing and critiquing people who are not following the latest trends in open science. This is an older piece by Dorothy Bishop and Stefan Lewandowski, who, Dorothy Bishop is an extremely vocal advocate of open science and research integrity. However, they felt that there was a risk of weaponization of certain aspects. So where you might be calling on data to be released, and actually in some cases the data couldn't be released for perfectly reasonable reasons, or you maybe needed controlled access to data sets. And yet the critics were essentially saying, because the data aren't public, then they use it to cast a shadow on the research. There's also an advantage to social media being open. I know, both Dorothy and Stefan have used that to an advantage, but it can also be used for harassment as well. freedom of information requests can be a great boon in the area of politics, but when it starts to move into the area of science, then that also can be a fishing expedition and something that is essentially causing stress to the scientists and the institutes. So we have to be careful to make sure that in the push towards open science, then we're not bringing along practices that are actually to the detriment of science. And so it's just a quick summary of those limits to openness. So we've got for open science, we've got the skepticism of platform capitalism and surveillance. We've got the issue of politicians and others weaponizing open research. Slow science advocates feel that in some ways open science contributes to a rush and that preprints are an essential part of that degradation of sound science. There's a risk as well that was in the slides there of named peer review carrying risk of retaliation that some people feel inhibits honest review. And there's also good evidence that double anonymized review, often known as double blind review, is fairer than single blind or open peer review. And so there's a study in a Wiley Ecology Journal, a randomized trial that was published earlier this year, and it showed very clearly that there was a bias towards high-income country authors under single anonymized review, and that disappeared under double anonymized review. So I'd be previously quite skeptical of double anonymized. It is difficult to do well, but under open peer review, that advantage can't be done. And in some ways, you may need to compromise. For example, there seems to be a bit of a tendency towards a consensus that you can combine double anonymized during review with open peer review, so you can have people named or the reports public after review. So there's just a reminder there that transparency is just one aspect of research integrity, and we've got to make sure that in particular the respect and rigor are upheld, as well as we're doing the kind of honesty, transparency and accountability bit, which is the side that very much chimes with open science. So I hope that came across okay, and I'll pass over to Catriona.
Thanks, Matt. Yeah, that worked perfectly. So, and thanks very much for joining for a slightly uncomfortable location. And thanks for sharing all these really interesting thoughts that I think will stimulate very good discussion later. So, Catriona, over to you.
Hello, I'm just sharing my screen, and I think it wants me to open system preferences. So it might be a problem. Just a second. Okay. Okay, I've got a security problem, which means I'm going to have to quit and re-enter Zoom, or you can present the slides for me, which is easier.
I could share your slides for you if you tell me when to.
Yeah, there is an animation in the middle, which is an issue, but we'll work it out. Oh, and I'm sorry, I forgot to share my video. Hello, everyone. That's a really interesting series of talks to follow up on, especially in relation, I think, Matt, the sort of antagonism about open science. But I hope that what we can do, or at least show, is that the principles of open science, at least if you adhere to them, as indeed the sort of was made in the UNESCO recommendations, should actually act to counter many of those concerns if it is implemented appropriately. And I think a lot of it is about equity and bias, and how equity can be maintained in a deeply inequitable system, and remove those biases that which Matt was talking about. Okay, this looks good. Thank you very much. So next slide. Okay. Oh, yeah. So this is really, and I want to put this up partly because open science is a global issue, and this is a global endorsement of the principles around open science. And open science is all the things you've heard about already from the speakers. But it's also the principles behind this, written in this document, are strongly linked to equity, fairness, and transparency. And as such, I think this really is a transformational change in the way we look at science, view science, structure science, communicate science. And next slide, please. This is an old slide of mine. Unfortunately, it's an even older issue, because if you think of open science as open outputs and open infrastructure within those set of principles, then no matter how much we have the technology or the infrastructure, or we make open access publications and other outputs available, nothing is going to change unless we change the culture of the way we look, evaluate, reward, and collaborate around science. Next slide, please. And a lot of the things we've been talking about, and publication manipulation, fraud, paper mills, is a huge topic. And Hindawi themselves have been in the eye of the storm about this. And my talk is not about that, but we have to acknowledge that this is a massive problem. It's not working. There is a deep mistrust in science. There is industrial levels of fraud. Now we're tackling this, and of course it's not just Hindawi, but across many different publishers are facing these problems. And we have in part to thank open access for others being able to look into these papers and expose some of the issues. And I would like to thank Dorothy Bishop, Nick Wise, and the Anonymous Sleuths for their huge investment of time and effort and expertise in doing this and exposing some of the problems. Hindawi themselves, and we're now Wiley, we've worked intensively over the past year, 6 months or so, to put in a new process to investigate at scale. As of this week, we've published more than 5,000 retractions that are the basis of a new investigation, which are aligned with the COPE principles, the new guidelines they're coming out around paper mills. And it takes an enormous amount of work, both internally and externally, to deal with this. And even the way we tackle research integrity problems when problems are discovered take too long, retractions take too long. We were able to put in a new process that essentially accelerated the retraction process. But the way we look at managing research integrity is also a huge issue. I'm not going to dwell on that just now, but if people want to ask me about it afterwards, I'd be welcome to talk about it. So next slide. So we're in this situation. We've and the other speakers have highlighted a huge number of issues around research integrity, lack of reproducibility, and we know there are these system-level consequences that are leading to what's being called the reproducibility crisis. It's leading to mistrust in science and mistrust in publishing. And we have to look at the drivers that have got us to this situation. And so next point, please. So, and it's already been spoken about as well by Roohi, researchers are embedded in this publish or perish economy, where evaluation is based solely on where you publish and how much. Next one, please. Combined with false proxies of quality, journal rank, impact factor, and institutional rankings. And that is often held, or the power of that is held by funders, institutions, grant panels, tenure committees. And of course, publishers sit within this system. Next slide, please. When you think about it, in the late 20th century, it's really, or before, it was a journal-based, I'm deliberately calling it an economy here, a journal-based economy based on subscriptions. We've shifted to open access, and one of the business models of that is about APCs, and then it's become more of an article-based economy. Now, I really want to make the point that what I'm saying here is not about open access. We had an absolutely wonderful, inspirational panel before this panel about different models of open access and how to create equity, sustainability for those that are not based on APCs that allow all the benefits of open access. But essentially what we have is, in a way, we've shifted from a journal-based economy to an article-based economy, but they have very common features because they're embedded in this evaluation system. Next point, please. So the journal-based economy, what we got, that incentivized growth in journals, huge commercialization of the scholarly landscape. It created big deals, what was known as a serials crisis, and there was a problem in that many could not get access, pay to read, which is what open access is trying to solve. Next point, please. However, with an APC-based economy or an article-based economy, that incentivizes growth in articles. Again, we have big deals. We now, I think, have an APC crisis, and we have deep inequity where authors and researchers cannot afford to publish. And no matter, and this goes back to the slide, that no matter how much we want open access, we have to change this system somehow in order to create the system level change we need to see the potential of open access and open science. Next slide, please. In relation to research integrity, of course, open science and transparency, the show and tell phenomenon that Matt was talking about does make it much, much easier to detect misconduct. And all of the things, whether it's transparent peer review, sharing data, pre-registration, sharing methods, results, code, all help detect that. And open access itself, as Dorothy Bishop has said, makes it easier to check articles because it allows for independent scrutiny. I think my headphones have just run out of battery. Can you hear me still? Can you hear me?
Yeah, can hear you.
Great. Okay. And, you know, transparent peer review would allay a huge amount of the problems about whether peer reviewing is done properly. Now, it needn't come with the names of the peer reviewers, but just seeing the reports would be valuable in itself. Next slide, please. Also, I think while open science and open access is a transformation, reproducibility and research integrity actually speaks to the fact that most researchers are doing their best. They want to publish and investigate questions. They want to collaborate. They want to share results. They do have deep integrity and scholarship. And there was a sense of that, I think, before, and it is certainly within disciplines now. You speak to academics. Most researchers are not out to manipulate and make fraud. Yes, there's huge high profile cases, both in subscription journals and open access journals. And as such, and this speaks to a term that Tony Ross-Heller thinks we should use, is that we should think about it as a reformation and not a crisis. And it's an opportunity in actually to go back to or to decide what the community norms of scholarship and practice and integrity are. Next slide, please. And this itself is coming to the attention of funders and governments and others. And again, UK Parliament speaks to reproducibility. And again, this talks to what both Matt said and Clarissa said and Roohi said about transparency. It's the ability that researchers have been sufficiently open to allow for a robust assessment of their work. There are different disciplines and reproducibility means different things to different disciplines, but every discipline has standards of rigor and transparency that can be adhered to. There are 3 huge projects being funded by the EC at the moment, looking at reproducibility, research integrity, and the relationship to open science. What's really important about this is that they are actively seeking evidence about what works and what doesn't work. And I think that speaks to the whole notion of this panel at the beginning about, how is open science? Does it actually help research integrity? And how do we know? And I think having this evidence-informed approach and using a sort of meta-research, research on research approach to look at outcomes and policy outcomes and what impact they're having and the perverse consequences is hugely important. Next slide, please. And so if we want system level change, we know it's not rocket science really. We have to evaluate and reward researchers based on good practice as well as outputs. But we also have to do the same for the other stakeholders, and that includes publishers, funders, and institutions. I think we should be paying publishers for good practices, good services, and quality of services rather than just for articles or journals. And funders and institutions, again, need to demonstrate their openness and their willingness to embrace open science through different types of evaluation schemes, being open about those evaluations and taking an evidence-informed approach to what works and using qualitative as well as quantitative indicators, and then tracking, monitoring, and mitigating and publishing, actually being open about the outcomes. And in some ways, what we're talking about are really in reference to publishers is what are the services that the community needs, the community of scholars, funders, institutions, and societies that will help shore up research integrity and reproducibility. I think many of those things, and those things that have been discussed by the Parliament, are open science. And what I would like to see is much more service level agreements around open science with publishers and paying for levels of service rather than an output as an article or a journal per se. Final slide, please. None of this makes sense unless we include equity capacity building as a fundamental part of research integrity, reproducibility, and open science. And I think that's what the UNESCO recommendations speak to. That's what has been mentioned time and time again during this OASPA conference. There are now coalitions of funders trying to look at different pricing and business models. There's a working group just established last week with Plan S that includes the Chinese Academy of Sciences, which is fantastic. It's taking a much more global approach. And OASPA itself has been working incredibly hard around equity and open access and publishing. And I've listed the 4 working group reports that have come out of that. And this is actually a plug for the next panel. So I hope you will stay to meet that. Next slide, thank you. And thank you.
All right, thank you everyone for these great presentations, and we are now ready for our Q&A session. So we have about 15 minutes before we need to close the session, and I see we have a few questions in the Q&A box. Okay, so I'll start from the first one that came in. It was for Roohi, but everybody else feel free to add to it as you like. The question was, do you know if peer reviewers actively consider any potential research integrity breaches, or do they tend to just focus on accuracy of content?
I would think they don't actively need to consider it, but of course they focus on evaluating the quality, the validity, the accuracy of the content. But because research integrity can take various forms like plagiarism or data fabrication or manipulation, they are not explicitly instructed to investigate or confirm these type of breaches, but they are probably expected to be alert to any signs or suspicions of misconduct. So not actively, but indirectly, they would call those out.
Any other comments from the panel? Okay, thanks, Roohi. I'll move on to another question. So it says, I have come across many editors, so for Matt originally, I have come across many editors who will require researchers to nominate reviewers for their submitted articles. How does this protect the review process?
I would say it's the opposite of protecting the review process largely. This is one of my hobby horses. Is personally, I would remove the ability of authors to suggest reviews at all. I think this is on two grounds. The first is that I'm going to see if I can start my video anyway. Just throw caution to the wind. There you go. You can see me in the holiday in here. So the first ground is that it enables peer review faking, so that authors often from paper mills can suggest fake email addresses that are pretending to be real people or even fake people, and editors who are unwary can invite them, and then you get the subversion of the peer review system. And so if you don't allow people to suggest reviewers, they can't fake review in that way. And that's something that's been happening for at least a decade now. I first spotted it when I was at PLOS a decade ago, and it's continued since. The other piece of evidence is more subtle. Now, I know of probably nearly a dozen studies on this, and every single one of them shows that author-suggested reviewers are more lenient than editor-suggested reviewers. And this is probably one, because of people who have direct conflicts of interest, so they should have declared or recused themselves, but they didn't, and so the editors and the publisher are maybe not checking those conflicts carefully enough. And the second is also then authors are unlikely to suggest people who are going to be very critical of their work, and so they will be hoping to direct the editors away from people who will be critical towards people who may be more favorable towards those work. And because of those various factors, it means that author-suggested reviewers are either going to be compromised or maybe biased towards the authors. And I think any editor worth their salt should be able to find reviewers. Now, I know that's not the case because many editors are struggling. It's got increasingly hard. I saw an example shared recently where an editor was very proudly showing that they'd invited 150 reviewers for a single paper using automated suggestions from the system. I think that isn't the way we need to go. I think editors need to get skilled at finding reviewers, and if you can't find reviewers, you shouldn't be an editor, and you shouldn't be leaning on the authors to do it.
Yeah, I'd like to add to that because I mean, Hindawi has a policy of not allowing reviewer recommendations. It doesn't stop reviewer manipulation, and again, you know, just also to pick up on this point, it's actually very difficult sometimes to pick up manipulation by peer reviews. And again, transparent peer review actually helps this because you can start to pick up plagiarism across reviewer reports in different journals and different publishers. And also to speak to Roohi's point about whether peer review, to the point asked of Roohi about whether peer reviewers are asked to pick up research integrity issues. I do think that some of them do, and when it's completely obvious, they will. But unfortunately, and I think this goes back to capacity building as well, and Matt's point that if you can't find reviewers, you shouldn't be an editor. There is very, very little to non-existent training for an editor. The expectation is if you are an academic, you therefore know how to be an editor and how to do these things. And there is no training for reviewers. And this is worldwide. And we should not be recruiting or expecting untrained editors and reviewers to be able to pick up some of these things that we are now picking up. And I think this also speaks to the issue of equity, because often there isn't, you know, when you look at journals, most of them are global north. They're handled by academics in the West. It's getting better, but they tend to be white men on average. Okay, there are disciplinary differences. And they've also been generally based in institutions where they have the financial support, the training, and the infrastructure support to support them. And there are many, many places in the world that do not have that. And this has to be addressed. And research integrity is therefore, I think, closely linked to that equity and capacity building. We have to create the skill sets and the training for them.
Thank you both. And actually, somewhat related to what you've both been saying, there's a question in the Q&A box about dealing with peer review rings. Are you aware of any way that could be done effectively?
Yeah, I think again, it's about open peer review. Ultimately, it's about transparent peer review reports. Make that review report available, publicly available. We'll pick them up soon enough. You know, machines can easily pick up for duplication. Of course, ChatGPT can create peer review reports. It's an arms race. But also, I think this is where preprints help. You get preprint review, especially initiatives by ASAP Bio, where you get eyes and open peer review on a paper before it necessarily goes to a journal or requires. And all of these things, I think, will help. Will it eliminate fraud? No, there will always be fraud around, but it will reduce it and mitigate against it, I think.
I think openness can. I'm sorry, Roohi, go ahead.
Sorry, I was just saying, just to add to what Catriona said, just having a more diverse reviewer selection, I think that will serve to some measure to solve for the peer reviewer ring, as well as identifying suspicious patterns of, you know, the same reviewers or authors reviewing for each other. I think that's another way that this could help.
Yeah, absolutely. I was going to say that transparency is one approach that can work, because certainly if, for example, you have open peer review where people are named, then external sleuths can spot patterns that maybe have passed by the publisher. And so they might be searching for, they've already seen strange patterns from one person, and then they go looking for them in the rest of the literature. So transparency can certainly help there. The other aspect, as Roohi was saying, was to have technical checks. So there are, Scholar One has one, there's the Paper Mill Spotter, which is just been released by the STM Integrity Hub. So there is now also a cooperative angle where publishers are coming together to share patterns that they've spotted, and also the technical tools to be able to tackle this kind of platform manipulation. So I think it's going to be a combination of those two. But Maria has also said, can we share flagged authors and editors? This is only something that can be shared in private, so that COPE has guidelines on sharing information between editors in chief, and so you can, when there's good grounds, you can share information. For example, if you see that a particular author has got a pattern of problems with their articles, you can share that with other publishers. And equally, if an editor has problems at your publisher, you're allowed to share that with others, but you're not allowed to kind of just blow the whistle openly in name and shame. This is something that the journal Curious did, and they took it down in the end. There's definitely defamation risks and all sorts of things, so I wouldn't recommend it, but report to institutions, discuss with other publishers, and also in some cases for peer review manipulation and citation manipulation, coercive citation. Clarivate are often very interested in this because it's something that affects the impact factor. It can affect the highly cited researcher list, so they're another body that can help police this kind of thing.
A lot of what we're talking about in terms, and most manipulation isn't done at an industrial scale, but it is happening, is that you can't look at one paper and see the problem. You have to look across hundreds, thousands of papers to pick up the patterns. And to do that, the information has to be open. So not just looking at the peer reviewers, also looking at the handling editors for papers and picking up patterns for them. At Hindawi, we've banned more than 300 editors from ever publishing with us or handling papers again because of the manipulation that's been going on.
Okay, thank you all, and thanks also for picking up other questions that were in the Q&A, by the way. So I left the first question that came in as the last one because it's a difficult question. It's both philosophical and practical at the same time. And the question is about reproducibility, saying I'm in favor of it, but wondering if a strong push for reproducibility could keep in the dark some ideas that could push science forward but are not statistically significant or potentially difficult to reproduce, I suppose. So any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I have. Maybe if I could, I just think it's the exact opposite of this. I think this the push for reproducibility is the push for responsible research practices more generally than just transparency, as we've been discussing here. And so abandoning this blindness to the statistically significant results would also be a part of that. And I think this loss of interesting results might be already happening now with the lack of transparency and lack of other responsible and robust research practices. We may have already lost some interesting drugs because they were not significant in an initial test with like 3 animals or something, just kind of silly. Yeah.
May I add to this? You're absolutely right, Clarissa. The other thing is publishing null and negative results are so important. You may have had a fantastic idea and okay, your experiment didn't give you the results you expected. That idea is still very good. And if it's published, you then get credit for the idea. Your idea can be cited. I would go beyond that and I'd say, do it as a preprint. Get your idea out there, published, and preprints can be cited. And you will then be the originator for that idea, even if the experiment you conducted. Most experiments don't work. Look at Matt's slide. Huge numbers of experiments. We learn so much, and it's not failure. We just learn so much by learning how other people approach stuff, what worked and what didn't, and we need to embrace that and reward it somehow as well.
And Catriona, if you want, I see in the Q&A that you wanted to answer the 300 people is a lot comment in the QA. If you want to address that in the next 30 seconds before we draw this to a close.
300 people is a lot, but I think one of the things, and we're talking about editors, is that, and this is something Cope makes very clear, retractions are not necessarily about blaming the authors. And we need to remove the stigma away from retractions as well. And it's very, very clear that, you know, we've published more than 5,000 retraction. Now, there are some papers in there where the peer review has been compromised and the paper may actually be legitimate. It needs to be peer reviewed properly again. The paper has to be retracted, but the sanctioning the editors
picking up the editors, making them accountable is hugely important. And that's something that hasn't really happened. And I think the community as a whole needs to do this and raise awareness about that and stop just blaming authors as well for sometimes things that they weren't trained to do, they don't know how to do. So 300 people is a lot, but actually it's not nearly enough given what's out there.
Thanks very much, and thanks for the concise answer. So yeah, I'm afraid it's time to draw this to a close. We've run out of time. I want to thank all of our panelists and audience once again for a really interesting discussion. So the next session focuses on equity and open access and will be led by OASPA themselves. Just so you know, you can stay connected or come back at any time using the same Zoom link. So yeah, for the time being, thanks everyone and enjoy the rest of the conference.